You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Parents of tweens, if you're familiar with far-off drop-offs...
Dad, stop, right here.
Or get DMs about what's for dinner, you may be experiencing tween milestones. For your son or daughter, these can start at age 9. HPV vaccination, a type of cancer prevention against certain HPV-related cancers, can start then too.
For most, HPV clears on its own. But for those who don't clear the virus, it can cause certain cancers later in life.
Embrace this phase. Help protect them in the next.
Ask their doctor today about HPV vaccination. Brought to you by Merck.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
This episode was revised, re-recorded, and produced according to my higher standards in 2024, around 7 years after the original episode was produced. It's now more representative of the kind of work you'll eventually find that I produce for the podcast. So if, after listening to this episode, you find you dislike the content, voiceovers, choice of background music, or the audio mix of other early episodes, and the background music was definitely too loud on some early ones, feel free to skip ahead to episodes from 2018 or 2019 when you can expect far better quality. Throughout the 19th century, as the character of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in North America, became a more and more popular figure in literature, she began to take on symbolic meaning that was explicitly racial. The poem I mentioned in part 1, which has her transformed by a Native American shaman into a white doe, also has her curse being broken years later, whereupon Virginia, the poet says, quote, lives to witness the natives' extinction and the wide occupation of their forfeited patrimony by that superior race, the Anglo-Saxon, with their bondsmen, the sable African, the red man's inferior, end quote. So we see, as the nation crept toward civil war, that the symbolism of the lost colony and of Virginia Dare in particular began to reflect Southern notions of racial hierarchy and white supremacy. After the Civil War, to defeated Confederates, her fate came to represent their own. Whereas she was undone by the Native Americans, Southerners feared they would be undone by freed slaves. So Virginia Dare became not the first English child of the New World, but rather the first white American, and thus a symbol of white supremacy. In the 1890s, a group of Southern women formed the Roanoke Colony Memorial Association, which hoped to, quote, awaken heartfelt pride that the first birth of that great race that now rules the continent was the product of North Carolina soil, end quote. Their group was followed by another Roanoke Island association, the Manteo White Supremacy Club, which, as white supremacists often do, characterized their efforts to, quote, perpetuate white supremacy, end quote, as a crusade to protect women from race mixing. Virginia Dare became the mascot of Jim Crow segregation. As the century wound down and the new century dawned, nativists then came to view her presumed destruction by quote-unquote savages as analogous to the feared destruction of white supremacy by immigrants. So it went. Virginia Dare was a useful symbol and metaphor that could be raised to make many a political cause emotionally resonant. By the 1920s, you could buy Virginia Dare dresses and Virginia Dare wine. Though these luxuries disappeared during Prohibition and the Great Depression, Virginia Dare and the lost colonists of Roanoke remained a powerful symbol. In 1937, an outdoor play called The Lost Colony was produced and performed on Roanoke Island as the linchpin of an effort to boost the North Carolina economy during the Depression. The same year, President Franklin D. Roosevelt designed a commemorative postage stamp depicting Eleanor Dare holding baby Virginia, and he attended a performance of the play on Virginia Dare's birthday. In an address on that occasion, Roosevelt likened the threats that Roanoke colonists faced to the threats that democracy then faced, proving again that Roanoke was an apt symbol that could be used to represent many things. Perhaps even, he said in his speech, it is not too much to hope that documents in the old country and excavations in the new may throw some further light, however dim, on the fate of the lost colony and Roanoke and Virginia Dare. And as if in direct response, 3 months later, the Raleigh News and Observer reported that the grave of Virginia Dare had been found, along with evidence of, quote, an ancient and highly cultured but long ago extinct civilization, end quote. Evidently proof that the colonists had flourished there in North Carolina after their disappearance. But as with so many claims of discoveries so monumental that they rewrite history as we know it, this one too turned out to be false. This is Historical Blindness. I'm Nathaniel Lloyd, and I find that history can be very like a message chiseled into an old rock. Hard to discern, even when you're squinting right at it, and not something you can take at face value. Thanks for joining me for a completely remastered and updated version of Episode 2, The Lost Colony, Part 2, The Dare Stones. Before we begin the episode, as I always do in more recent episodes, I want to thank my patrons on Patreon for their support of the podcast. Typically, this is where I thank new patrons by name, but since I'll be inserting this into my main feed as the first episode, I'll just say here that the patronage on Patreon has made it possible for me to continue producing this program, which I research, write, record, edit, mix, and master all by myself. Patreon support has helped me to earn a bit of remuneration for all the time I spend on the podcast, far more than any ad revenue has done. And it's so very satisfying to know that there are devoted listeners out there who want to support my work on this project. It's the least I can do to give something back. So Patreon supporters get an ad-free feed, they get episodes early, plus I'll usually share teasers for upcoming episodes, and they receive fully produced exclusive episodes about 10 to 15 minutes in length between most episode releases, making this a weekly podcast for Patreon supporters. Head over to patreon.com/historicalblindness and consider supporting for as little as $1 a month. Now, on with this completely rewritten and re-recorded second episode of the podcast. Welcome to Historical Blindness. As with the other recent re-release of the first episode in this series, I'll be sharing this remastered and updated episode as a bonus episode to make sure it's brought to the attention of all my listeners, and I'll be inserting the new audio and show notes into the original episode. After a while, I'll probably delete the later bonus releases from the feed, which means in the future, if you're listening to this, it's likely because you are new to the podcast and decided to start at the beginning. Welcome, and thanks for listening. You should know I don't always talk about the podcast so much in the episode, but I'm remastering these early episodes in an effort to retain new listeners who may otherwise have tried the first episode and then decided not to listen further. As I explained in part 1, and go listen to that first if you haven't, I started this podcast with the intention of promoting a historical novel I wrote about the beginnings of Mormonism. And when I took on Roanoke at the beginning of the podcast, It was specifically because of this second part of the story, the Dare Stones incident, which I found very similar to some aspects of Mormonism. For example, Joseph Smith claimed to have discovered, or actually been led by an angel, to some buried gold tablets inscribed with reformed hieroglyphics. The Book of Mormon is the result of his supposed translation of these tablets, which likely never existed since he claimed he was forbidden to show them to almost anyone. What is interesting here is that the contents of the tablets he says he found rewrite the history of the American continent. Like that purported discovery, the Dare Stones, a series of inscribed stones, the first of which had inspired that Raleigh News and Observer article in 1937, were also a supposed discovery of dubious artifacts that appeared to reform our understanding of history. New listeners will find that this is a major recurring theme in the podcast. Numerous times, I've devoted episodes to similar inscribed stone frauds. In 2020, there was a bonus episode on Drake's Plate. In 2021, I discussed numerous such archaeological frauds related to pre-Columbian transoceanic contact theories. Along the way, I've brought up similar hoaxes in several patron-exclusive minisodes. And to coincide with this re-release, I'm writing a new episode on another controversial inscribed stone artifact. I've also written numerous pieces of short fiction about these objects, which I'll likely collect in an anthology at some point. You could say it's something of a fascination of mine, and the story of the Dare Stones is perhaps the most entertaining such tale, and one that brings the story of the lost colony of Roanoke to a bizarre and rather absurd conclusion. Following the report in the Raleigh News and Observer, Haywood Pierce Jr., a young history professor at Emory University in Georgia, hurried to correct them. It appeared that a closely held secret of the university had been leaked and reported incorrectly. Virginia Dare's grave had not been discovered, nor had any evidence of some lost civilization, as the newspaper had made it seem. Rather, a rock had been carried into Emory University of Atlanta by one Lewis E. Hammond, a tourist from California, who said he'd found it near Albemarle Sound in North Carolina. This 21-pound slab of quartz, which carried a mysterious engraved message, immediately captured Pierce's interest, for its inscription appeared to be a message from none other than Eleanor Dare. On its face was a cross, significantly a Latin cross, the kind with the vertical line longer than the horizontal, and not the Greek or Maltese cross with arms of equal length, which had been the agreed-upon signal to indicate the colony had fled danger inland. Beneath the cross was carved the message, "Ananias and Virginia Dare went hence unto heaven, 1591. Any Englishmen show John White, Governor, Virginia." On the reverse side of this stone, a longer message was carved, seemingly in Elizabethan English. This one harder to make out for its Middle English orthography and the fact that both A's and O's seem to appear as rough-hewn dots. As best as can be discerned, it reads, "Father, soon after you go for England, we came hither, only misery and war 2 year. Above half dead ere 2 year more from sickness, being 24. Savage with message of ship unto us, small space of time. They, affright of revenge, ran all away. We believe it not you. Soon after, ye savages, feign spirits angry, sudden murder all save 7. Mine child, Ananias too, slain with much misery. Bury all near 4 miles east this river, upon small hill. names writ all there on rock. Put this there also. Savage, show this unto you, and hither we promise you to give great plenty presents. This message was signed EWD, presumably for Eleanor White Dare. The stone told a clear enough story. Soon after White left them, the colonists came, quote-unquote, hither, presumably to the place the stone had been found, where they suffered misery and war for 2 years, losing more than half their number to illness within another 2 years. We are given the number 24, though it seems unclear whether that represents the number who expired or who survived. It sounds as if it is the number dead, but this would not be, quote-unquote, above half the number of colonists left behind. So Pierce read it as the number who survived. Thereafter, a quote-unquote savage, or Native American, seems to have reported to the surviving colonists that a ship approached, and this caused some fear of revenge that drove the natives to flee, even though the colonists apparently did not believe the ship to belong to their countrymen. Afterward, supposedly driven by angry spirits or simply in an angry mood, the natives massacred the remaining colonists, leaving only 7 alive. According to the stone-cut message, Eleanor's child and husband were among those slain, whom they buried around 4 miles east of, quote, this river, end quote, presumably meaning the river near which the stone had been left. And they were buried under a hill where they'd left another stone, this one a grave marker inscribed with the names of the dead. The message ends by explaining that this stone had apparently been put there also, or was to be put there at the gravesite, or that it had been given to a native to give to White, or as the reverse side indicates, with the instructions to show it to any Englishman, who would then presumably show it to White, on the promise that the native messenger would be rewarded with gifts upon delivering or showing it. A convoluted instruction to which we shall return at length. The find, if genuine, was a monumental discovery, but Pierce and his colleagues were wary of hoaxes. After all, earlier that same year, a distinguished historian in California had been made the fool when he fell for a hoax. Herbert Eugene Bolton was enthusiastic over the discovery of a brass plate said to have been inscribed and left in California by Sir Francis Drake. But when it turned out that Drake's plate of brass was a forgery perpetrated by a group of clampers as a practical joke, it irreparably harmed his reputation. Determined not to suffer the same fate, Pierce and some other academics from Emory University examined the stone and questioned its discoverer, Lewis E. Hammond, closely. Hammond said he was a tourist visiting the East Coast from California. By one report, a seller of produce, Hammond claimed to have stopped along a newly built causeway in swamplands along the Chowan River in North Carolina to hunt for hickory nuts. These swamps had for many years been inaccessible and even rumored to be a pirate haunt in days of yore. So when Hammond tripped over the 21-pound piece of quartz and saw its inscription, he thought maybe it represented a clue to the resting place of buried treasure and took it with him. 2 months later, he arrived at Emory University in Atlanta, seeking a translator. Pierce and his colleagues saw no evidence of fraud in the stone, noting that its inscription might have been made with tools available to colonists, and that its message appeared consistent idiomatically and orthographically with Elizabethan English. Therefore, they followed this mysterious Hammond to the place where he claimed to have found the stone. Hammond took them to the causeway and whipped out a crude map scrawled on a paper bag, but to their chagrin, November rains made it impossible for him to pinpoint the site where he had pulled it from the ground. Frustrated with his search, Hammond led them to a sandbar. There, an old sunken barge marked the place where he had supposedly washed the stone. And not only washed it, but scrubbed it with a wire brush and accentuated the lettering using a pencil. These misguided efforts of Hammond's were later blamed for the inability to properly assess how long the stone had lain in the swamp. However, the professors who accompanied Hammond were universally convinced of his honesty, asserting that he was too natural and simple to be pulling one over on them. So Pierce finally published on the find with an article in the Journal of Southern History, concluding that the language was consistent with Elizabethan usage and that it had been inscribed with tools that would have been available to Roanoke colonists. In his article, at Hammond's request, Pierce did not name him as the artifact's discoverer. While Pierce was sold, others at Emory University, especially the administrators, remained skeptical, not wanting to be made fools of, but still feeling that the stone warranted further investigation. Meanwhile, public officials from North Carolina, who had built a lot of their economic recovery plan on the tourist draw of an outdoor play that this stone now threatened to prove was historically inaccurate, insisted publicly that the find was dubious, and historians from North Carolina, where the stone had actually been found, bristled over the fact that it was in the possession of a Georgia university and demanded to collaborate on its study. Pierce, feeling embattled, bought the stone from Hammond, sending money to the man's California post office box, and brought it to Brunel College, a small women's college near Atlanta, where his father served as president. From that point on, investigating Hammond's Dare stone became a family affair, conducted by Haywood Pierce Jr., his liberal stepmother Lucille, and his father, Haywood Pierce Sr. Their first order of business was finding the grave marker alluded to in the stone's inscription, as a way to verify its authenticity. Between 1938 and 1939, while on a leave of absence from Emory, he and his father and stepmother undertook numerous surveys and excavations around Edenton, in the immediate area near where Hammond claimed to have found the stone, all the while shutting out any interest from local historians, though he did welcome any promising leads. The former mayor of Edenton wrote Pierce with just such a tantalizing anecdote. As a young man, he had performed logging work in the swamps east of the Chowan River, just where the Dare stone claimed the grave marker could be found, and incredibly, he recalled a remarkable moss-covered stone upon a hilltop that might have been the very marker Pierce sought. Of course, Pierce set out to find this rock, and on finding it, he very carefully removed the moss, but found no inscription whatsoever. Nevertheless, he began to excavate the hill, certain that he would find the resting place of the dead colonists, but there was no indication of remains at all. Regardless of this dig's failure, Pierce was undeterred, and since he credited media promotion of his investigation for that first promising lead, he thought that further advertisement of his search might provide a real breakthrough. So he offered a $500 reward to anyone who could find or lead them to the grave marker in question, a decision he would eventually come to regret. Almost immediately, fraudulent inscribed stones started turning up. One, for example, had Virginia Dare's name carved into what turned out to be a genuine English ballast stone, such as the kind the Roanoke colonists might have had. Close inspection proved that the names had been recently carved into the rock, though. Perhaps this early fraud made the Pierces wary, but their recognition of its inauthenticity also may have made them confident that they would be capable of spotting any further forgeries. It was then In May of 1939, almost a year and a half after the arrival of Hammond's Dare stone at Emory, that William Eberhart, an uneducated stone worker, approached Dr. Haywood Pierce with another find, this one purportedly found some 300 miles from the first, south and west, and one state over in South Carolina. The stone Eberhart showed Pierce was inscribed with a much different style of script that at first blush seemed unreadable, although a date, 1589, could be discerned. Pierce dismissed it as a Spanish gravestone, telling Eberhart they would keep the stone and translate it, but that the reward they had offered was only for a stone that would be found near the Chowan River in North Carolina. Eberhart, undaunted, returned with 2 more stones bearing the same date and supposedly found in the same area. One might imagine this trying Pierce's patience as he explained to Eberhart again that the stone he sought would not be found in South Carolina. Moreover, Pierce apparently explained to Eberhart exactly what the date on the stone he sought would be, and therefore one might imagine that he very well could have shared some further details with Eberhart about what he expected to find carved onto the Dare gravestone he so desperately wanted to discover. Then, in what to Pierce seemed an amazing development, but which in retrospect seems an unsurprising eventuality, Eberhart returned with exactly the stone Pierce pursued. This new stone Eberhart brought him bore the following legend: "Here layeth Ananias and Virginia. Father, savage murder all save 7. Names written here. May God have mercy. Eleanor Dare, 1591." On the reverse surface were inscribed 15 names, which in combination with Ananias and Virginia Dare was exactly the number of dead Pierce expected to be memorialized on the grave marker. Even the names appeared to be correct. A triumph of luck and archaeology, it seemed. But what about the fact that Eberhart still claimed to have found this stone so far from the first stone? Rationalization can scale any mountain, it seems, for Pierce simply changed his theory to accommodate. Since the Hammond stone seemed to indicate that it had been given to a Native American as a message to be brought and shown to an Englishman, he reasoned that the first stone had been carried by its Indian bearer from South Carolina all the way to North Carolina in search of the promised Englishman who would trade great gifts for it. Now for a brief intermission. As listeners of Historical Blindness, you're no strangers to the fact that history is a lens through which we can better understand the present. Or as Shakespeare put it, what's past is prologue. History is the indispensable context without which we cannot hope to truly understand current events. You understand that, and so do the creators of the American Scandal podcast. Every season, they immerse listeners in the biggest controversies in U.S. history, helping us understand America's dark side and learn from its troubled past. Its latest season, Ruby Ridge Standoff, delves into an incident that sowed the seeds for the rise of the modern radical right. It transports you to 1992, where in a remote corner of Idaho, federal law enforcement surround a small cabin. They've come for Randy Weaver, a survivalist who took his family to the mountains in anticipation of the apocalypse. A simple weapons charge brought the agents here, but the situation is about to explode into a deadly and tragic standoff that will later become a rallying cry for far-right extremists, fueling distrust and violent anti-government sentiment for decades. Follow American Scandal on the Wondery app or wherever you get your podcasts. You can binge all episodes of American Scandal's Ruby Ridge Standoff early and ad-free right now on Wondery Plus. Every summer, I'm careful to avoid getting burned. My summer plans always include applying sunscreen so I can attend barbecues and protests without worrying about getting scorched. And when I make my plans by making phone calls, I also don't want to get burned by an outrageous wireless bill. That's why I switched to a Mint Mobile plan and saved enough to take a summer vacation. With Mint, I found no difference in speed or coverage, just a big difference in cost. And right now you can switch to a Mint wireless plan like me to avoid sweating those surprise charges and overages. You'll just be chillin' with Mint's offer of 3 months premium service on the nation's largest 5G network for just $15 a month. With high-speed data and unlimited talk and text, it might just be the coolest thing happening this summer. This year, skip breaking a sweat and breaking the bank. Get this new customer offer and your 3-month unlimited wireless plan for just $15 a month at mintmobile.com/blindness. That's mintmobile.com/blindness. Upfront payment of $45 required, equivalent to $15 a month. Limited time new customer offer for first 3 months only. Speeds may slow above 35 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to Carvana. Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
From Fort Sumter to the Battle of Gettysburg.
From the Emancipation Proclamation to Appomattox Courthouse.
From the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Compromise of 1877.
From Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman.
To Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson.
The Civil War and Reconstruction was a pivotal era in American history.
I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy.
And we're the hosts of a podcast that takes a deep dive into that era when a war was fought to save the Union and to free the slaves.
And when the work to rebuild the nation after that war was over turned into a struggle to guarantee liberty and justice for all Americans.
Look for the Civil War and Reconstruction wherever you find your podcasts.
Now, back to the show. Here is where we must begin to examine the message of the Hammond stone, as it bears on Pierce's estimation of the Eberhard stones, for it reveals poor critical thinking on Pierce's part. If he had thoroughly considered the message inscribed on the stone, some glaring inconsistencies would have revealed themselves. The original stone referred to a grave, quote, east this river, end quote, as if the Hammond Dare stone was meant to remain in one location, planted as a landmark, presumably there on the eastern side of the Chowan, where it empties into Albemarle Sound. One interesting fact is that Hammond claimed to have found the stone just across the river from Site X, the location covered by a patch on John White's map, seemingly to designate the site of a planned or secret fort. Of course, there was no way for Hammond to know that at the time when he claimed to have discovered the stone, since that patch was not noticed for almost 80 years. And some have, since the discovery of the Site X patch, argued that the location alone proves the stone genuine. The fact is, though, that no irrefutable evidence has ever been found of the lost colonists' presence either at Site X or across the river where Hammond said he picked up the rock. Also, the quartz itself, while common elsewhere in North Carolina, did not originate from that locale, so it was clearly carved elsewhere and carried there. But having the stone moved at all absolutely defeats its purpose as a landmark meant to indicate the location of the grave. If the stone were given to a Native American who carried it elsewhere, it could not act as a guide to the grave marker on the hill east this river. To serve that purpose, it would have to stay put by said river. But then the stone says, quote, put this there also, end quote. Does this mean that Eleanor put the stone there at the gravesite? If so, then it couldn't serve as the landmark directing the reader eastward from a river. Or was that perhaps an instruction directing any Englishman to place the rock there? If so, this contradicts the instruction to show it to White, as well as its purpose as a landmark. Let us further consider the, quote, savage show this unto you, end quote, portion of the inscription. Of course, Eleanor White would not have believed that a Native American would be able to read the Elizabethan English on the stone and follow its instructions, so it would only make sense if she had somehow communicated its meaning to one or more natives. But also, if she wanted a Native American to carry the message to an Englishman, it would not make sense to carve it into a 21-pound rock that would be such a burden. All signs point to the notion that the rock was intended to stay in one place, by the Chowan or some other river, as a landmark that perhaps she had explained to some few Native Americans with whom she had been able to communicate, promising that if they led an Englishman back to the stone, they'd receive gifts. This understanding of the stone's supposed purpose still does not explain the put this there also line, but otherwise the stone is wholly nonsensical. If it were meant to stay by the river and point any who came across it to the grave, then it would defeat the purpose to place this stone also at the grave, or to instruct natives to carry it away from that spot to an Englishman in exchange for gifts. If she had been making a carved message for a native to carry to an Englishman, she would have used a piece of wood, which she would have been able to carve much more easily and quickly, and which would not have been so difficult to carry. But also, if we're to believe that she made the Hammond stone as a landmark to which natives were supposed to lead Englishmen, why not just entreat the natives to lead Englishmen back to the actual gravesite itself? The more one considers the content of the Hammond stone, the less it makes sense. But to Pierce, there was no questioning it, as the stones Eberhard brought him indicated that the colonists had gone southwest into South Carolina. It could only mean that the Hammond Dare stone had been hauled hundreds of miles from where it would have actually served some practical purpose as a landmark. Upon interrogation, Eberhard revealed his complete lack of education, which made him more trustworthy in Pierce's eyes, for how could an uneducated laborer manage to approximate Elizabethan language, and how would he have been capable of forging a convincing message? Eberhard explained that by pure chance while traveling, he had discovered multiple engraved stones resting in a gully at the base of a hill. He had taken only one with him as a curio, and had returned to recover others when Pierce had been uninterested in the first. Indeed, he claimed to have discovered 13 more stones there, and he produced all of them for Pierce. Of course, Pierce then insisted that he be shown this actual site, and Eberhard obliged, leading him into a rural area near the Saluda River and showing him a depression in the ground, where he said he had discovered the stones. Further convincing was Pierce's investigation of Eberhard's background, which confirmed his lack of education and therefore the likelihood of his inability to accurately mimic Elizabethan language, and his lack of familiarity with relevant historical records that corroborated the names inscribed on the stones. The final indication to Pierce that Eberhard was on the level came when the man passed a tricky test. Trying to catch Eberhard out, Pierce suggested that rather than accepting the promised $500 reward, Eberhard take only $100 and a 50% stake in the property on which he had found all the stones, a piece of land that, if the stones proved authentic, would surely be worth far more in time. Eberhard's decision to take the stake in the property seemed to confirm to Pierce that Eberhard himself believed the stones to be genuine. He therefore made the deal, feeling more confident in the discovery, and sent Eberhard out to find further stones in the South Carolina area and into Georgia. since the stone with the colonists' names had a further message along the edge that read, "Father, we go SW or Southwest," which in retrospect seems to have been a clear effort by a forger to explain why the Eberhard stones had been found hundreds of miles southwest of where Pierce expected to find them. Pierce hoped more stones would be found to the southwest of Eberhard's Hill. The next stone to be found, however, was not turned up by Eberhard, but by a resident of Atlanta named I.A. Turner, who claimed to have found the stone along the Chattahoochee, southwest of the hill, while hunting. He contacted Pierce because of an Atlanta newspaper piece on the other stones. Turner's stone matched all of Eberhard's in its script. Signed again by Eleanor, it appeared to indicate that more stones would be found by the same river. And sure enough, Eberhard thereafter discovered 9 more stones along the Chattahoochee. And in the next year, as dozens of stones were lugged in by various different people for scrutiny, the last vestiges of Pierce's skepticism were finally obliterated when an assemblage of Georgian farmers reported that they had seen such stones inscribed with what they had always believed were the writings of Native Americans up to 50 years earlier. One farmer, T.R. Jett, who had lived throughout his childhood in the area where these latest stones had been discovered, claimed to have seen 2 such stones in his youth, one of which had been displayed in his family's mill and widely remarked upon. While he could not recall what had become of those stones, the aforementioned I.A. Turner, another local and the first to find a stone in Georgia besides Eberhard, claimed to recall where the stone had been discarded after its exhibition in the mill, and fantastically managed after so many years to find it for Pierce. The second stone from Jett's memory had apparently been hauled out of the river and split into 2 pieces, one of which had reportedly been used as part of a stone construction in a barn that no longer stood. One would think this fragmented stone could no longer be found, but with a little encouragement, Jett managed to find one half in a ditch and the other in an old tool chest. The pieces fit together perfectly. The only thing that remained was to test the authenticity of the stones themselves. And behold, the stones did pass scrutiny, although whether or not that scrutiny might have been cursory or deficient is hard to surmise at this historical distance. In all, 48 Dare stones were discovered after the first, 42 of them by Eberhard. Always the stones were picked up with no witnesses around to confirm their discovery. At most, Eberhard was sometimes able to show indentations in the ground that fit his finds. The inscribed story beyond the first stone was predictable at first, and then, before its conclusion, sensational. The stones indicated that some so-called savages had shown the colonists much mercy, whereas others from the east had massacred them. Talk of burying the dead was common. All the while, some effort was made to look for Governor White's return. A dubious claim, considering how far inland these stones had supposedly been found. Thereafter, talk of a native king taking the surviving colonists in and taking Eleanor as his wife seemed to take the narrative in a decidedly romantic direction. This story was not unfolded to Pierce in any linear fashion, as stones were found out of the chronological order of the tale they had to tell. But eventually all was pieced together. If the stones were to be believed, Eleanor Dare, after losing her husband and daughter to murder, married a native chieftain, lived with him, possibly in a cave, in quote-unquote primeval splendor, and eventually bore her new husband a child, another daughter, whom, according to one stone, she named Agnes, and whom, according to another, she hoped her father would find and take back to England. Eventually, some conflict arose among the natives owing to the birth of the girl. But before that could be further explicated, the narrative resolved with an ominous remark about Eleanor's sudden illness. This story in stones concluded with a date of 1599, when it might be presumed that Eleanor expired from some naturally arising ailment, although it was also speculated that she was poisoned by those of the tribe who were upset over the birth of her daughter. Regardless of any conjecture this story might inspire, however, all theories arising from it were soon proven moot, for consensus regarding the authenticity of the Dare stones was about to shift rather dramatically. So confident had Pierce become in the Dare stones, despite all the red flags, that unlike during his initial investigation of the Hammond stone, when secrecy was the rule and he refused to let experts examine it, in 1940, he invited a panel of 34 scientists, including the preeminent Samuel Eliot Morison from Harvard, to examine the stones. Surprisingly, the experts he consulted found Eberhardt's stones to bear what appeared to be authentically Elizabethan language. Moreover, their inscriptions in most of their particulars, such as the names mentioned, appeared to correspond with extant accounts from John White and John Smith. And finally, chemical tests to examine oxidation and weathering seemed to indicate that the stones were old, although how old could not then be determined. And, more importantly, that the cut surface within the engraved letters appeared to be equally weathered. With this scholarly support, Pierce wrote to the Saturday Evening Post regarding the stones, and the Post sent journalist Boyden Sparks down to Georgia to look into the matter. According to the article that Sparks eventually published in the spring of 1941, the journalist found that Pierce immediately grew wary and even hostile when Sparks suggested that it stretched the imagination to believe a Native American might have been prevailed upon to lug a 21-pound stone around on the off chance he might be able to exchange it for goods sometime in the unforeseeable future. Sparks inquired about the University of Chapel Hill's lack of interest in the stones, and Pierce suggested that Paul Green, faculty at Chapel Hill and author of the by then very popular outdoor drama about the lost colony, was angry because filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille, who had been sniffing around Green for source material, had now turned his attention to Pierce. Sparks sharply pointed out that Hollywood's optioning of historical source material had become a big business, especially there in Georgia after the success of Gone with the Wind, and suggested that this entire affair of the Dare stones may have been a scheme to draw Hollywood's attention, even going so far as suggesting that Hammond, the mysterious Californian, might have been a hoaxer on some Hollywood production company's payroll. Indeed, as Sparks uncovered, it seemed that someone had tried to sell such a stone at Manteo, where Green's play was put on, long before Hammond ever showed up at Emory. According to Sparks's article, a local senator remembered some huckster who came through the area promoting a real estate project and a coastal highway, and this character had outright suggested the creation of bogus relics using old ballast stones. Among the other schemes this out-of-towner had brainstormed were faking the discovery of one of Governor White's buried chests, and carving the word Croatoan on a log and sinking it out where fishermen would pull it up in their nets. According to Sparks, who says he tracked down records of this mysterious man kept by the administrators of that coastal highway, this stranger had even been caught filming Paul Green's play with a handheld camera on opening night and had been asked to cease and desist. Perhaps most discrediting, though, is that Sparks claimed Pierce knew about this suspicious story, yet still gave weight to Hammond and his stone. Sparks further debunked the notion that various unaffiliated farmers independently corroborated the existence of the stones found in Georgia. According to his article, Eberhardt was close friends with all the other finders of the Georgia Dare stones, and the Jett family, who purported to remember the stones in their mill, was also acquainted with Eberhard through his companions. In fact, while Pierce had asserted that Mr. Jett easily identified the stone from memory, Sparks's interview with Mr. Jett suggested that the man actually made the identification under rather strange circumstances and with no small amount of coaching. It seems Jett had shot his landlord with a shotgun, and it was while being held in jail that he was approached by Pierce and shown the stone through the bars of his cell. Jett did not identify it immediately, as Pierce indicated, but rather had done so only after getting out of jail. So Sparks implied that Pierce may have aided in his release in exchange for his testimony as a quid pro quo. Jett's remembrances are further made dubious by his claims that he never could read the quote-unquote Indian writing on the stones in his youth, whereas the stones he identified are clearly inscribed with English lettering. Sparks's working theory was that the Jett stones were purposely inscribed with G's carved to resemble the figure 8s mentioned in some witness accounts of old stone relics, which probably did at some point exist, but which had nothing to do with Roanoke. Moreover, Sparks went himself to examine the tool chest, in which Mrs. Jett reportedly found half a stone that fit perfectly with the other half a stone that had supposedly been part of an unmortared pillar. And in his article, he made a convincing case that any stones banging around among tools in a chest and surviving the ruin of a building would be chipped and not fit together, as he puts it, as neatly as a, quote, freshly broken teacup, end quote. Although there does appear to be corroboration for stones with, quote-unquote, Indian writing being stored in that tool chest, he suggested that in pursuit of the reward money offered, Mrs. Jett could easily have replaced the remembered stones for one manufactured by Eberhard and his cronies. Sparks not only cast doubt on Hammond and Eberhard, but he also pointed out ways in which Pierce had essentially invited fraud and swindlery by offering monetary incentives, and even more damaging, that he had seemingly exaggerated or misrepresented the details of his own investigation into the stone's authenticity. For example, one of the other finders of stones in Georgia, known friend of Eberhard I.A. Turner, had apparently been promised some pay by Pierce and told Sparks he planned to sue Pierce over the matter. In his interview, Turner insinuated that if the stones were hoaxes, Pierce knew all about it. Sparks also indicated that Pierce's investigation of Eberhard's background had actually turned up some suspect past behavior, such as the fact that Eberhard at one time was known to have sold bogus Native American relics to an antiques dealer. Pierce allegedly left this bit out of his writings to the Post, as well as, we may assume, his reports to the 34 scientists he asked to examine the stones. And when Sparks finally met up with Eberhard himself, finding the man in a shack, sick and intoxicated, he learned of another detail Pierce had glossed over. The way Pierce told it, the fact that Eberhard had taken an interest in the land on which his stones were discovered rather than the full $500 reward proved he was on the level. However, in 1940, Eberhard had sold his share of the land back to Brunel University for $1,400, which, along with other remuneration for stone hunting, amounted to far more than the original reward. So it would seem Eberhard was a savvier businessman than Pierce represented him to be. Moreover, while Pierce had characterized the hill as uncultivated, Sparks reported that a local farmer grew cotton on it, and when shown photos of the stones, asserted he'd never seen them there before. Then, perhaps the most ridiculous aspect of Eberhard's story, Sparks pointed out the overwhelming coincidence that only Eberhard had found stones even when other, more learned men were searching the same areas, and that by the end, Eberhard was finding them conveniently quite near his own rustic shack. That fact, combined with the fact that the original Dare stone, the Hammond stone, had been discovered in North Carolina, and then when Pierce in Georgia advertised a reward for more stones, they were suddenly found all over Georgia in his own backyard, should have been enough to demonstrate that at least every stone after Hammond's was a fraud. But more and more it seemed that Pierce may have purposely looked past the indications of forgery. Sparks dug through reports on scientific testing and found that Pierce had ignored findings by experts that letters had been carved to purposely avoid disturbing lichen, and that some even appeared to have been carved as recently as a few days or weeks earlier. Moreover, Pierce appeared to have purposely misrepresented expert evaluations of the stones to say they could not be produced through shortcut methods, when in fact it seems any stonecutter might have accomplished the same engravings using a variety of modern methods. Furthermore, Pierce's claims that the language on the stone was altogether consistent with Elizabethan English conveniently ignored that linguists had observed a few words, including quote-unquote primeval, that appeared wholly anachronistic. And perhaps most damning, since it goes to motive, was Sparks' discovery of Pierce's correspondence with film director Cecil B. DeMille, indicating he did indeed hope to sell the Dare Stones story to the filmmaker in the form of the rights to a new play. Different from Green's outdoor drama, this one written by himself and based on the story related in the Eberhardt Stones. After Sparks' Saturday Evening Post article titled "Writ on Rock" was published, Bill Eberhardt contacted Pierce's stepmother, Lucille, and requested a meeting, which she agreed to, thinking Eberhardt wanted to show her a new stone. Indeed, he did have a new stone to show her, but this one was inscribed with a threat. "Pierce and Dare Historical Hoaxes," it read. "We dare anything." Eberhardt informed Mrs. Pierce that he would release the stone to the post as proof of forgery unless the Pierces gave him $200. Pierce received this message from his mother, and whether or not the fact that Eberhardt had indeed forged his stones came as a shock to him, it undoubtedly was received with dismay, for the jig was up. Pierce went to confront Eberhardt with a witness, and Eberhardt reportedly received them with a rifle laid casually and menacingly across his lap, advising Pierce to keep his distance. Pierce demanded something in writing before he would surrender the money, but Eberhardt would sign nothing incriminating. Afterward, with only the corroboration of his witness to validate his claim, Pierce went to the press and made the front page of the Atlanta Journal on May 15, 1941, with the headline, "Hoax Claimed by Dare Stones Finder in Extortion Scheme, Dr. Pierce Charges." The effect of the Post and Journal articles was to turn the Dare Stones into a nationwide laughingstock and destroy Pierce's academic reputation and career. Although Eberhardt denied Pierce's allegations, saying that he'd never forged any stones, but rather found them where Pierce had told him to look, the matter of the Dare Stones was laid to rest in the court of public opinion. For the next 70 years, the Dare Stones were all dismissed as hoaxes. All of Eberhardt's hoax stones, as well as Hammond's original stone, were hidden away in a Victorian house's attic on the campus of Brunel University. An embarrassment. And there they likely would have stayed, the subject only of the occasional sensationalist TV series like In Search Of, if interest in them had not been rekindled in 2010 by University of North Carolina historian David LaVere in his book The Lost Rocks, which suggested that the Hammond stone, the original Dare stone, might still be genuine. While LaVere only suggested that the Hammond Dare stone had not been proved or disproved, This has opened the doors for pseudo-historical broadcaster The History Channel to jump on the bandwagon, and in a docudrama released in 2015, suggest the rock is genuine. New listeners will find that the History Channel and their poor scholarship and outright misinformation will appear again and again in episodes of this podcast as a major purveyor of pseudo-history. In this case, the channel's program on the Dare Stones follows a couple of stonemasons, the Vieira brothers, who are best known for a previous History Channel special attempting to prove the existence of an extinct race of giants, a conspiracy theory previously discussed by one of the Vieiras in a TED Talk that was subsequently removed by the organization as pseudoscience, and a topic I have refuted myself in a two-part series. In their special on the Dare Stones, the Vieiras investigate on behalf of the Lost Colony Center for Science and Research, a sensationalist society that pursues a variety of dubious theories in regard to the colony's fate, such as that the colonists relocated as part of a secret operation to harvest sassafras, a crop valued as a curative for such ailments as syphilis. The film goes into detail telling the story and has the brothers examining the stones. Of course, they find that Eberhardt's stones were likely engraved using a drill press. No news there. While the first stone's lettering is, they suggest, more consistent with chisel work. More interesting, though, is the claim of one Dr. Kevin Quarmby, presented as an expert linguist in the program, although his background appears to be more in the area of Shakespeare and early modern drama rather than linguistics, that the word ye with a superscript e, which has long been taken as a second-person personal pronoun as in you, is actually representative of the written form of the definite article the, which would seem to indicate either authenticity or a counterfeit of such genius that the forger was actually better versed in Elizabethan language than the Harvard professors who evaluated his work. This assertion and others led Brunel University to call for renewed academic examination of the first Dare Stone. The results, as demonstrated by Andrew Lawler in my principal source, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, has been mixed. Lawler himself consulted numerous experts. While an expert in medieval graffiti carved into the rock walls of churches and the Tower of London felt the carvings could be genuine, Elizabethan language experts disagreed on whether Eleanor Dare would have used her maiden name in her initials, or whether she would have called her husband by his first name. Some suggested that certain misspellings were uncommon, and that the phrase, quote, "great plenty presents," end quote, sounded like a bad impression of Native American speech, as was widely heard in Western films of the 1930s. Another common problem pointed out was that it made no sense for Eleanor Dare to have spelled out the number 7 with several characters in a rock engraving when people of that era would commonly have used Roman numerals, which only would have required carving 3 characters. And lastly, after World War II, a document was discovered that proved John White's return visit to Roanoke had occurred in 1590 rather than 1591, as had long been believed. So the date carved into the rock actually reflected this imperfect understanding of history, which the colonists themselves would not have had, but which a 1930s forger would. Although these many problems seem enough to dismiss the original stone also as a fraud, some scholarly dispute may be enough to keep a little hope alive, which means we must take a closer look at the stone's purported discoverer, the enigmatic Lewis E. Hammond, who claimed to have been traveling with his wife as a tourist when he discovered the stone, though no one ever saw her. It occurs to me now that it should have seemed very strange that a simple salesman, a produce seller as far as can be determined, was able to take so long a holiday in the midst of the Great Depression. He was from California, visiting North Carolina, and 2 months later he was still on that side of the country to bring the stone into Emory University in Georgia. Moreover, he turned out to be something of a phantom, pulling a disappearing act just like the lost colonists. Due to their immediate suspicions of a hoax, Pierce and his associates at Emory had tried to tail him one night, but were eluded. On another occasion, they tried to collect his fingerprints from a glass, but to no avail. Emory administrators, who remained skeptical long after Pierce had become a true believer, even hired Pinkerton detectives to investigate his background, and no evidence of the man's existence was ever turned up. Hammond provided a contact, an Oakland jeweler named Dove, who confirmed that he had done business with Hammond, but he knew no way to contact him and only said he was, quote, a regular fellow, end quote. The facts that he gave a P.O. box for correspondence, failed to provide any genuine personal references, and declined to be named by Pierce in publications are all extremely suspicious. The Vieira brothers of the History Channel special say they hired their own investigator to track down proof of a Lewis E. Hammond's existence in California at that time. And tantalizingly, they claim to have found proof of a Lewis Hammond who served time in Folsom Prison around then for forgery. However, the age of this prisoner seems to be different from that of the Hammond who brought in the stone to Emory, according to descriptions, so the connection remains indefinite. The only fact that seems to have been confirmed is that he hailed from California, as after leaving Georgia he wrote Pierce from somewhere in Alameda, California, suggesting that Pierce and Emory University charged 25 cents to view the stones. All this proves, though, is that Hammond hoped to get some money for his find, which he eventually did when Pierce paid him for the stone. After this payday, Hammond promptly vanished. Was it possible that Lewis Hammond was in league with known forger Bill Eberhardt? One account suggests, at least, that this was not so. According to Boyden Sparks, it appears that Hammond stuck around long enough to be aware of the Eberhardt stones, and Eberhardt's co-conspirator Turner claimed to have been approached by Hammond and asked to find a stone with the word Yahoo on it. This apparently was an attempt to prove that Eberhardt and his friends would turn up a stone with any word asked for, thus demonstrating their stones to be hoaxes. Turner and Eberhardt did not take this bait, though, and Pierce, unfortunately, took this as further evidence that Eberhardt was in earnest. In reality, though, if Hammond was himself a hoaxer, as many signs seem to indicate, then he would have known that the later Dare stones were themselves hoaxes, and might have been motivated to expose them for horning in on his con. What seems most likely is that Hammond was that same huckster known to be planning similar pranks around the Manteo area during the premiere of Green's play. It seems far-fetched that he was a Hollywood henchman dispatched to drum up a marketable narrative for a future blockbuster, but perfectly plausible that he was a hoaxer who attempted to defraud historians for a payout that he did successfully receive. The stone did appear weathered, even within the inscribed letters, and some have suggested it was too far-fetched that a hoaxer could have the expertise to both fake that weathering using chemicals and fake the Elizabethan writing well enough to fool experts. But Bill Eberhardt, an uneducated swamp dweller who lived in a drunken stupor in a shack, managed to do exactly that, and we know this for certain. Why couldn't Hammond have done the same? Beyond all the problems with the Elizabethan language that experts have observed, it seems the most discrediting problem is the confusing content of the inscription itself, casting it as both stone missive and landmark. But regardless of its baffling message, modern science should be able to settle the matter one way or another, through geochemical analysis. However, Brunel University, while encouraging renewed study of the first Dare Stone, has balked at allowing such definitive testing. Perhaps worried if it were proven a fake once and for all, they might again receive the kind of bad press they did back in the 1940s. Until such time as they relent and science can prove what it really is, the Dare Stones, or at least the first Dare Stone, will forever remain an inseparable part of the historical mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke. Thanks for listening to Historical Blindness. You can find blog posts for each episode on historicalblindness.com that contain a transcript, related imagery, and citations for further reading. Typically here at the end of the episode is when I thank partner patrons on Patreon by name and give them a special message. So if you're interested in financially supporting the program and being thanked at the end of every episode, consider pledging $10 or more a month on Patreon. Or you can get access to the ad-free feed and exclusive episodes for as little as $1. Some music on this episode was licensed through a Blue Dot Sessions blanket license at the time of the episode's publication. Additional music is by Kai Engel and by Kevin MacLeod. Check out the show notes for a list of the tracks used. You can support the show by pledging on Patreon or by making a one-time donation on PayPal. Find those links in the show notes, or find me on Venmo at Historical Blindness. Until next time, remember, while some historical mysteries do persist, most have been kept alive artificially or were entirely manufactured, because fraudulently rewriting the past can not only earn you money, it lets you recast events according to your worldview. Keep listening to the podcast, and you'll find that happens a lot.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Have you ever gazed in wonder at the Great Pyramid? Have you marveled at the golden face of Tutankhamun? Or admired the delicate features of Queen Nefertiti? If you have, you'll probably like the History of Egypt podcast. Every week, we explore tales of this ancient culture. The History of Egypt is available wherever you get your podcasting fix. Come, let me introduce you to the world of ancient Egypt.